Welcome to another week of Let's Start Justice with Jamaicans for Justice. This is the place that you can hear about your rights and, of course, get an informed perspective of the different pieces of legislation that we have before Parliament so you know its implications for you. I'm Michael Jackson, Executive Director of JFJ.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice.
All right, Jade, how are you doing?
I'm hanging in there.
Okay.
I'm hanging in there. We had a brief break yesterday. Can't say it was a lot, but
the one-day holiday.
The one-day holiday.
Don't worry. Christmas is coming up.
Can't wait.
All right. So just our usual, we just want to do a little recap of the human rights issues that we saw coming out in last week. And of course, we recognize that school violence continues to be a challenge. There was a video that I believed shocked the nation last week, Jade and listeners, where we saw two students who were hitting another. And apparently one of the students has since been charged for assault with, what's the terminology in the Offences Against the Persons Act?
It is assault occasioning bodily harm.
That same one.
Yes.
And unfortunately, a youngster will be navigating the legal system. But it really brings the question, or begs the question, about how we deal with youth violence within the school system and gang formation and so on. And I just think it's important to recognize and to tell the listeners that the Integrity Commission, the Joint Select Committee reviewing the Integrity Commission Act, they are seated today.
Yes.
And JFJ will be making a presentation tomorrow at 10
Yes.
o'clock. And lastly, for this week in review, we saw where the Rastafarian community is calling for an anti-discrimination legislation. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think they are maybe not the same motivations, but are definitely in line with something that a lot of human rights groups, including JFJ, has been calling for some time.
Yes.
One of the gaps in our legislative framework is that we do not have any broad anti-discrimination legislation. So though we have that provision in our constitution, limitedly in our constitution, there's nothing that works extensively to implement that. And so we are hoping that our duty bearers are listening to the fact that it's not just us in the human rights sector that are calling for something for anti-discrimination. It is those groups who we have identified as well as those needing such kind of legislation are also calling for it. And we will lead that directly into our right of the day. So our right of the day today, it is in line with our topic, which is today about the minimum wage and our labor standards, and our right of the day is the right to work. So unfortunately for us, it is not a right that is reflected in our constitution, though it is a right that we have signed on to several international instruments, such as the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. We are also a part of the International Labour Organization, and both of those offer the persons a right to work, and that means that you're able to gain sustenance from freely chosen or accepted work. So that means that you should not be forced into choosing whatever work you choose, and you should have fair working conditions. This week we are also doing another trivia of the day for your credit prize, and the question this week is: what is the proposed increase in maternity leave by the government? So recently our government made some comments about increasing the period of maternity leave from its current state. So what is that increase? Will it be 3 months? Will it be 2 months? Or will it be 4 months? And you can participate in this trivia by sending us a message on our social media pages or sending us a WhatsApp at 876-239-7583.
All right, thanks so much, Jade. And I think as we look at the trivia question and the right of the day, it really brings to fore how exactly we deal with labor standards, which is the topic that we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely.
Minimum wages, minimum labor standards. What can companies do more beyond what is mandated in law? And is what is mandated in law sufficient? So, effective April 1st, 2022, the national minimum wage was increased for all workers except security guards from $7,000 to $9,000 per 40-hour work week, and for private security guards from $9,700 to $10,500 per 40-hour work week.
The new rates were the result of the recommendations from the National Minimum Wage Commission, which conducted public consultations and submitted its recommendations to the ministry in 2020.
Now, we are aware that we operate in a free market economy, and the purpose of minimum wage is to protect workers from unduly low wage and, of course, in instances of exploitation by establishing those minimum standards. Nevertheless, when we look at findings from the research done in 2021 by the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI, they had expressed concern that the minimum wage is far too low to ensure families can live above the poverty line.
Also of concern is our minimum labor standards, which this conversation was reignited when we had some labor unrest in our civil services earlier this year, among the public sector wage negotiations that have been taking place. So persons are trying to introduce leave provisions around maternity, paternity, and family leave.
And of interest, which we mentioned last week, is the case involving the National Housing Trust versus Marksman, wherein the security guards who are engaged by the security firm are deemed as employees and not contract workers. And this have also reignited conversation about workers' right. And interestingly enough, since that court ruling, the private security firms have been calling for an increase in the 40-hour work period to increase it up to 60 hours. So it brings into question the issue of long working hours and how we deal with this conversation about independent versus employees.
Yes.
So that's a topic we're going to be discussing in short order, and we're going to be joined by Dr. Diana Thorburn, who is the Director of Research at CAPRI, and Saint Patrice Enis, who is the President of the Union of Technical, Administrative, and Supervisory Personnel. Do we have both persons online? They're both here? Okay, welcome, Dr. Thorburn, and welcome, Mr. Enis. Good afternoon to you both.
Ennis, E-N-N-I-S.
Mr. Ennis, you're with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, my apologies for damaging your name. I stand corrected. Thank you for joining our program. So let us start with you. Do you have any opening statement, if you will, on the current minimum wage?
You meaning me or?
Mr. Ennis, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. Any opening comment?
Yes.
Well, currently we are in the process, in the consultative stage. As you perhaps would have known, I'm also serving a capacity as one of the commissioners on the Minimum Wage Advisory Commission, and we continue to have our consultations. The next one is tomorrow in Manchester, as it is expected that we will conclude such consultations later on this year, and hopefully we can submit our recommendation to the Minister of Labour, who would take it to Cabinet, and hopefully we should have something early next year, or that will be determined by Minister and government. So we are actively looking at making recommendation with respect to the minimum wage. You would have known that it was increased. You mentioned in your
Yes.
in the beginning that it was increased this year, but that is after 4 years, because the last increase prior to that was in 2018, I believe. And so it is, so the recommendation for that one actually went in for this year. And so we are in the process of doing that again.
Okay, but for right now, is there a figure that you have in mind that you think is perhaps something you can live with? I remember the opposition leader asking for it to be increased up to $12,000 for this year.
Yes, I do, but I wouldn't tell you because my what we do is make our recommendation to the minister, and that remain with him until and that's their position, the government's position. But it is not so much my individual or my personal position that matters, and that is why we have these consultative arrangements. And different groups are expected to submit their proposal. And all of that would be taken into consideration, even from PIOJ and so on. And the respective organ, whether it's the security guard body, from other unions, from employers, and so on. And it is after that process, then we will look at all the material that we have and make a recommendation. And I emphasize recommendation because we do not determine what the minimum wage is. That is solely the
Okay. Mr. Ennis?
within the purview of the
Minister.
government of the day.
All right. Dr. Thorburn, are you with us? Are you hearing?
Yes, I'm hearing and seeing you.
Okay. Thanks again. Capri did a study last year, I believed, amid COVID. What were some of the major findings when you look at minimum wage?
Right. So thanks for having me and for giving us the opportunity to share about our work. And I think that the report you're referring to was the impact of COVID on vulnerable groups. Am I correct? We did 5
Yes.
studies on impact of COVID. So forgive me that I'm not being remembering exactly which one it was that we had said.
It was the one that spoke to the impact of COVID on vulnerable families, and
Right.
it did mention the issue of minimum wage and how persons were coping. And perhaps I think the lead researcher at the time had indicated that the minimum wage was not able to really assist families with living above the poverty line.
Well, so, I kind of have to do this. Forgive me for being a bit academic, but I think we have to be clear that we're separating when what we're talking about between minimum wage and a living wage or a livable wage, because they're two very different things, in the sense that minimum wage is something that is legislated, whereas a livable wage or living wage can be somewhat more subjective, and it's usually something that is agreed on by consensus, in sense that where in Jamaica we've defined a living wage or livable wage as a socially acceptable level of income that provides adequate coverage for necessities such as food, shelter, child services, and healthcare. That socially acceptable level is going to be something that is determined by, so many other factors that would not go into the same kind of consideration of what would inform legislation for minimum wage. So I'm going to try and talk about those two things separately, just so that we can make sure that we're keeping the conversation. We're not, blurring the lines and getting confused.
Dr. Thorburn, I'm really sorry to disturb your thought. We're going to have to take a break. We were due on a few minutes ago, and then we
Okay.
come back.
Sure.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are having our discussion today about minimum wage and minimum labor standards. If you would like to make a comment about anything you hear or any thoughts you have about this topic, you can call in at 876-676-4996 or send a WhatsApp message to 876-239-7583. We are back with Dr. Diana Thorburn and St. Patrick Ennis. Dr. Thorburn, you were making a point before we left about minimum wage versus a livable wage, and I got an understanding of your explanation, but I wondered, before you continue, do you think is the best practice for implementation in terms of ensuring the well-being and human rights of citizens? Well, minimum wage or livable wage?
Well, I think that was where I was going, is that both are, and I think Mr. Ennis alluded to this, though both are very complex issues that require consideration, lots of different variables. So with regard to minimum wage, if you look at research around the world, there are some jurisdictions where minimum wage has actually increased unemployment, and there's others where it has pushed up base wages. So there's no one outcome of minimum wage. That's one thing that I think needs to be taken into consideration, that minimum wage and how it's decided and implemented is very context specific, and also will change from one time to another. So an economy that is doing better is going to have a higher minimum wage than an economy that's not doing very well. Also, an economy that's performing well is going to probably be more likely to have a minimum wage base or ceiling is going to likely have an upward effect on pushing up wage rates, whereas an economy that's not performing very well is going to do the opposite. For Jamaica, and maybe Mr. Ennis can say this, I don't think that we have done the research to determine what have actually been the outcomes of the different legislative measures towards implementing a minimum wage, what effect it has had on wages overall and on employment. But I also don't think we know the extent to which the law is implemented. I mean, do we have reports, for example, of people who are not being paid minimum wage or who are being paid lower than minimum wage? That's, I think, one of the questions that we would need to have a better understanding of, to understand how it's working in Jamaica and what effect it's having and the extent to which it's benefiting workers. I mean, certainly the principle behind having minimum wage legislation is that it's almost like a collective bargaining mechanism for workers who have much less power than employers do. And so it allows them to, you have someone, or the state in this case, advocating on their behalf in a way that they would not be able to do for themselves. But I think there's also the question to be asked is, is this what people are actually working for? The very outset, you mentioned, Mikhail, that we do live in a market economy. There's an idea of, at what wage does the market clear, which is always interesting to relate that to a minimum wage, because if the market, we are paying, was it $7,000 a week? I think it was from 7,000 to 9,000.
9,000, yes.
Are there people who are accepting now $9,000 a week, or are there people for whom the lowest wage that you could actually get someone to work for you for is $10,000 a week, or is it that it's I don't know if you're following where I'm going with this.
No,
but
no,
there's
we're
so many
following, and
considerations,
because one of the questions,
including what is where is the market clearing in Jamaica right now, which would help us to understand better what role the legislation is playing.
Yeah.
yes, thank you so much. One of the questions I wanted to shift to Mr. Ennis, and let me start by saying the issue of affordability has been raised before by persons to indicate we can increase the minimum wage, but can persons afford to pay it? Especially when we look at persons, for example, employing domestic workers, not because they can afford to, but because it is a necessity for them. And then we also look at the high levels of informal workers that we have in the country. And I was wondering, Mr. Ennis, you spoke about public consultation earlier. What is the public consultation saying, if you can share that? What is the feel, the pulse of people, and what is the process of engaging the different trade unions and different stakeholder groups? If you can share anything around that process, so we have an understanding of who is involved, what sort of input they're making, and what the collective bargaining is really dictating.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to remember all of that. But
What you can remember. What is your public consultation saying, and who is involved?
Well, the public consultation is where we go. We would announce publicly through different media outlets where we're going to be, and basically they coordinate with the Ministry of Labor, and in order not to be overcrowded, people would indicate their likelihood of attending, and we make accommodation to facilitate that. And so the likely groups are, to be honest, is mainly employers that do attend these events. You rarely have persons from the the worker group, and it is understandable why. Because these people, as alluded to earlier, are persons with not whose skills are not necessarily competitive in the market space. And so they are less likely to be absent from work because that may mean a day's pay. And so they likely don't show up. Or even sometimes you have to take into consideration that if they would even show how free would they speak when their employers or supervisors are in their presence. And so what we try to do is also have communication through the social media and by writing in. And we are not a righty country.
Yes.
So we try to use WhatsApp and what have you to get the views. But it's largely the employers, um, mainly the employers that we hear, and from multifarious sectors, I might add, and that will turn up. What is the minimum wage? Likely, no. It is often the case that from the employers that we hear about, most people do pay above the minimum wage. And that is because it's difficult to find somebody to work for $9,000 a week, as is the
Mr.
case.
Ennis, I
But
really
we,
hate cutting you, but they're telling me we have to go to a break. So I hope I can keep you both for a few more minutes after we return, please.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are talking about minimum wage, and we're back with Dr. Diana Thorburn and Mr. Ennis. Mr. Ennis, back with you. I wanted to ask, listening to your what you said about your process and the challenges that you have speaking with the employees versus the employers. When you compare the employer statements of saying, yes, we're paying more or at the minimum wage, versus what is reported by the employees, is there any discrepancy? Or and with that gap with the being able to reach out to employees, is there any ideas about how that gap can be filled?
the employers who would generally attend our consultations are not the ones who would be generally flouting the law or the act. Um, but what we do have is, yes, there are cases that were reported to the Ministry of Labor, particularly in the area of the security guard industry, where we now understand what the prescribed because we do have two minimum for generally speaking. And so we establish those each along with other things with respect to the security guards, for example, insurance, handlers, how much for handling, um, with accessories and so on. But there is discrepancy, yes, but not from those who are in attendance. So from time to time,
I
the
see.
ministry will get those complaints. And one of the difficulties that the ministry has is that it doesn't have a lot of officers to investigate and go around investigating these complaints, or just randomly walking into places and looking at records and so on. So there is work to be done in that area. But right now, what we can everybody now understand that the minimum wage is low. As I said just prior, it took 4 years for this one to be to be addressed. And so we're actively looking at seeing how we can make some improvement in that regard. And I believe that sometime within early next year, we should have some adjustment made, particularly in light of what has happened with the court
Security.
ruling with respect to the
Yes.
marksman case.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Ennis.
Survived this.
Y- we're having some trouble hearing you, so I'm just gonna move over to Dr. Thorburn because I wanted to ask. We heard The government made some statements recently about the changes in the maternity leave and the increase in that time. I wonder if Capri has any research on our current labor standards or conditions, things related to that, whether or not employers give maternity leave, what are the working conditions of persons. Has Capri done any research in that area?
Well, we haven't done anything specifically on that, but we've certainly done several adjacent issues, not specifically on labor standards, which I think is another conversation altogether apart from looking at things like maternity leave. The government is also proposing paternity leave.
Yes.
Which is a very exciting idea. But if you think through how that would be implemented, is it going to be given to those, to fathers who are resident in the household in a country where we have single parent households? It's a predominant family model with, and where a father is present, it's often a visiting relationship. So those are things that have to be, are going to have to be sorted out, I imagine, before they're going to be able to move forward with paternity leave. Maternity leave, I think the proposal is to extend it. This is the law. If you are working with a registered employer and you are pregnant, then you are legally entitled to this maternity leave. I think one of the things that we should take into consideration, though, when we're thinking about whether it's maternity leave or other labor standards, is that, we are when you put these kinds of restrictions on employers, you may end up keeping more people out of the labor market than you think that you are, than any advantage you're bringing. So, for example, if it is that there's a certain standard that in applying it would add to the overall operating cost of the entity, they may just decide, well, I'm not going to go down that road or hire that extra worker or explore that area of business because it's not going to be viable for me. And that takes me back to what I said earlier about being very clear on the context in which you're talking about these issues, because they're so dependent on the overall economy and the state of the economy and the health of the economy. So minimum labor standards in one context, just similarly with minimum wage, is going to be very different in how they're constructed, in how they're applied, in how they're implemented, and what good they will actually do for workers.
Well, I think it sounds to me like our first step needs to be, as you would have alluded, some research in this area, because I don't think we are aware of even what to address in such a holistic way that we'd be able to make effective legislation.
There are a lot of research questions here that I think, they're interesting for research's sake, but I think they would also help to inform policy so it's more grounded in what the actual needs are and what employees are willing to, what employers are willing to do, what employees are willing to do, what suits the employees best, what suits the employers best, and so on.
And if I may, Dr. Thorburn, it's not even just the employees and the employers, but it does have cost implications for consumers and the service users. I take, for example, the same Marksman case, because the issue then comes if a recommendation is made that we increase the 40-hour work week to 60-hour. There comes the argument of whether or not that is perhaps some sort of exploitation. That is what is in the public space. But if it is that we are asking the private security firms to pay more, it would have some implication for the service users. Can we afford to increase our own costs that we're paying for private security? So it opens the floodgate. Yes.
That example, Mikkel, that's a really great example. If you kind of think through the implications of that, security services are a very much needed service in Jamaica. Very few entities of any sort are able to operate without security services simply for the safety of the people who work there. That's the reality. If you, there may come a situation, it's quite, something that we could see happening where because of legislation, there is a minimum wage that people cannot afford. What is likely to happen is that people are just going to go into the informal economy to procure the security services that they need. That informal economy may include people who are running their own security services, what we now call protection rackets, because people need the services of security. And if you price it out of the market, then people are just going to, you're going to create a black market in that for that particular good or service, and you're going to have a whole other set of problems to deal with from then on. So there are kind of effects of these kinds of changes that we sometimes don't think through and think we don't game it out fully, that if we do this, what's likely to happen. I'm not saying that security guards shouldn't have an increase in their minimum wage.
Yes.
But I just would like for us to be more aware that these kinds of changes come with, there's a domino effect that impacts on other areas that we might not have thought through before we make the changes that we're proposing.
Thank you so much. Mr. Ennis, you had indicated before that the particular court case may have some implications. Can you just quickly say what those implications are from where you sit?
Well, it will have implications on cost and how workers are treated with respect to their with certain benefits. For example, all these holiday pay, even redundancy, all of these things come in with respect to the workers now being deemed to be employees rather than independent contractors. And also it would have implications for the employer in terms of paying over their statutory deductions and so on. So immediately there will be a cost implication,
yes.
and that is to take effect, or is taking effect as we speak.
All right, great. My last question to you, Mr. Ennis. Dr. Nigel Clark, the Minister of Finance, had indicated that come October 1, the public service staff orders would have seen an amendment to allow the increase in the maternity leave, introduction of paternity leave and family leave. From where you sit, are you aware if that staff order has since been amended, and whether or not your members are aware of such change?
Well, I'm accustomed to grand announcements. Well, it was indeed that took place, the announcement took place, but I don't think the necessary consultation is taking place for that date to be an effective date for the implementation of a paternity leave. I am not aware of the consultations taking place. I mean, it is something that we aspire to. I believe it's on the card with respect to public sector workers and maternity being extended by 1 month with pay. But I'm not sure if that it is going to be effected on the 1st of October.
Oh, and just indicate, today's October, the 18th?
Today's the 18th,
Okay.
yes it is.
All right, so, just to make...
I thought you meant November, really, when you said October, sorry.
Well, I think the announcement did indicate October 1st, if my recollection stands correct.
Well, that has not happened.
Okay. And is there a call from your desk and those who you represent for any clarity in law around the treatment of independent workers versus employees?
Well, there is a consistent call, whether by the trade unionists or in the Senate or publicly, and even in the various places that we represent, even in government too. The largest employer of contract workers is the government of Jamaica. And so that has been a constant discussion, and there's a constant call for some clarification in law. But that has not taken place. Not sure of the reasons why, but yes, there's a concern called by all trade unionists and by all persons who are concerned that there need to be some more specificity in the law where that is concerned, as many people use the law now to disguise independent contractors or disguise employees as independent contractors, where in essence it's amount to a form of exploitation.
Right.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back.
Well, I think we just want to extend our appreciation to you both for joining, and thanks so much for sharing your views, and we hope to hear from you again as we continue the topic. So that was Dr. Diana Thorburn, lead researcher at the Capri, and Dr.
Saint.
Oh, I'm giving Mr. Ennis doctor status, but it's well deserved based on his knowledge. Thank you so much, Mr. Ennis.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are in the final stage of the show now, the best part. We're going to be doing our call-in segment, and we're also going to be talking about our public view. So our public view for this week, which was posted on our Instagram. If you're not following us on Instagram, you're missing out. Our public view was what labor rights or laws should be strengthened to address fairer working conditions for workers. So we have a couple of comments. One comment states that the Minimum Wage Act needs to be strengthened. It is currently the minimum wage is currently way too low, and it does not reflect the realities of livable standards in Jamaica, which I think is the distinction that Dr. Thorburn was making earlier, Mikkel, between livable wage and minimum wage.
Yes.
We also have a comment saying that they think that the minimum wage provisions and the labor provisions really only apply to those persons who are employed traditionally, and those who are employed outside of the traditional scope have no protection, which is also correct. We do have a very informal labor system here in Jamaica. A lot of persons are informal or unregistered workers.
What is the percentage? I think they said over 40% of workers are
That's right.
informally, and even the conversation about daily income is something we need to have when you talk about domestic workers, for example.
Yes.
Many times I get personal messages, what is a reasonable cost to pay someone? And when I answer, a person says, so much money, are rich, you're rich. But you have to consider the fact that persons have to transport to come and so on. But these are the conversations that I had. But it comes down to affordability.
Yes. Unfortunately.
As well. I mean, it's something to consider, the balance of affordability versus respecting employees' rights. And should a different standard be set for private companies versus individuals in the domestic setting? So there are many things to speak about.
I think it is an area that could really, as Dr. Thorburn would have said, could really use some more extensive deep dives into the effects of the provisions that are currently in place. But also, we would have seen record rise in cost of living between COVID and now.
I have a friend who is a capitalist. We don't get along. And one of the conversation he has said to me was that you bleeding hearts, that's what he calls me from time to time when we're in heated debates. If it is that you want persons to attain livable wage, what is the role of the government? And it goes back to the conversation that we've had about guaranteed minimum income.
Yes.
So since you think people should be earning more, I can only pay so much and no more, and therefore should the state then
be
step in.
supplementing it.
So that's something.
It's an interesting conversation.
I don't agree there, particularly. I call for guaranteed minimum income, but not because of failure of private sector to meet certain standards.
Okay. Well, we do have one comment coming in, and if you would like to contribute to this conversation, be sure to call in at 676-4996 or to send a WhatsApp message to 2397583. And this person sent a message through WhatsApp. They said they've been working for 3 years with no contract. What should I do? And I'm not going to say this is legal advice, as they have trained me to say, not to say.
And as JFJ wouldn't allow.
But what I will say is that is extremely concerning. If it is a position of employment that you would like to continue, maybe you can give us a call at our offices.
To find out if there was even ever a contract and whether or not such contract wasn't renewed.
Right. So, yes, give us a call. at JFJ's office's numbers, or you can send to the same WhatsApp that you would have WhatsApped with this question. You can send some more information so that we can pass it on to our legal team and they can consult with you as to what exactly should your next steps be.
And there's also the email complaints
at jamaicans4justice.org. Complaints at jamaicans4justice.org. Yes, but this is an issue that we would have seen a lot in, as they would have talked about informal ways of gaining income. One of the issues that have come up, in my practice at least, is persons who are given a contract. They have signed it, but the employer have not signed it, and they're not in their presence, and they're not given a copy. And so I ask, okay, so how do you know what are the provisions under which you're working? They say they don't know. They just get a message in WhatsApp, and they are to respond whenever they get the message in WhatsApp. But I mean,
some contracts are so poorly written as well.
Yes.
So I think in that regard, and you can correct me here, Jade, wouldn't the labor standards that we have step in?
Well, they should. I think one of the issues that we have is the fact that in order to fully address this, you may have to take this to a court level. Because one of the things that we've identified, and that would have been discussed with our guests as well, is the construction of a contract that in construction, it is a contract for employment. And in title, it is a contractor's, independent contractor's contract. And in that case, you may find it difficult to gain redress in non-traditional areas. But, once you get it to the court, there is precedent to show that where the contract is read within the body of it to be a contract of employment, it would be deemed as such.
Yeah.
But the persons that we're talking about, it's a civil suit. You take on a civil suit, you pay for that yourself.
So there's the issue of knowledge of these things. You know you're being exploited, you feel it, but you're not too sure about what avenues
exactly
exist and what the issues are. And I think what is concerning for me with the whole independent contractor issue is the fact that we have persons who are being asked to work beyond certain hours. So the hours are long, the salaries are pitiful, and statutory deductions are not being paid over. So when time comes to benefit from certain things like the same NHT, NIS provisions, you're not even getting enough to do your own pension planning. So when retirement age comes, then
there is no retirement.
You're a burden to family, burden to the state, and you can't really help yourself. And I think that is the challenge we're having, really. But
I think it's especially concerning because it's not as though these people don't work. As you would have said, they are working extremely hard in this time before retirement.
The impetus is on the state, Jade. I think we have to move beyond just the regular law, having certain social benefits, inadequate labor laws. Some of them are good and quite good compared to United States. But I think, for me, I think the right to work should be in the Constitution.
I have to agree. And I have to agree that our government needs to do more to address what is our informal economy.
Yes.
How do we formalize so that these persons who are the majority or almost the majority of our workers are able to benefit from those social services that the government is implementing? Because there can be good services, they tend to be good services, but the majority of persons who are affected cannot get it. So I also want to give us the response to our trivia. We're running out of time quite rapidly. So our trivia question for today was, what is the proposed increase for the maternity leave? And the correct response is 3 months. So we do have a winner.
And the 3 months is coming from 40 days.
Yes, the 3 months is coming from 40 days. So it's welcome, I'm sure, for those persons who are pregnant and those persons who are thinking about pregnancy.
And who plan to.
So we have a winner. She won through our IG pages. I'm gonna just go with Disco because I cannot pronounce the rest of this handle. But thank you so much for participating.
Discovering or no, Carla?
Mikhail. But I will say that you've won some phone credit and somebody from our communications team is gonna reach out to you for your prize. So we are at the end of the time, Mikhail. Thank you for joining us on Let's Start Justice.
It was a good day. Thank you.
Yes, it was a good discussion. And for those who think they may have been concerned with some of the things we discussed here, or who have issues with contracts or labor issues, you can send us an email at complaints@jamaicansforjustice.org, and we'll see if it's something that our organization can help you to address.
And lastly, just reminding our listeners to tune into PBC tomorrow. JFJ will be making a presentation before the Joint Select Committee on the Integrity Commission Act. Right.
Yes. So thanks again for joining us. My name is Jade Williams. I'm a Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice.
Michael Jackson, Executive Director.